You want my ID? Then you better be absolutely sure you want to go down this road, officer, because once I take this out, your career is over. Those words were delivered without heat, without trembling, without any of the desperation that usually accompanies a man in handcuffs, and that more than anything else was what made the entire coffee shop go silent. But we will get there. First, you need to understand the town and the morning and the particular kind of arrogance that can only thrive in a place like Oak Haven. Oak Haven sat just outside Chicago, like a postcard that had never been touched, a suburb so meticulously maintained that even its contradictions looked intentional. The lawns trimmed with surgical precision, the cars exclusively German or electric. The coffee shops serving $12 lattes with hand-drawn leaf patterns on the foam, and the police force that prided itself above all other achievements on keeping the wrong kind of people from lingering too long on the right kind of streets. It was the sort of town that had never needed to say certain things out loud because the architecture said them quietly enough. The wide, clean sidewalks, the warm amber glow of the storefronts, the way the patrol cars moved through the neighborhood with the slow, proprietary confidence of a landlord checking on his property. Into this particular Tuesday morning stepped Special Agent Darius Cole. He was 49 years old, broad-shouldered, unhurried, wearing a charcoal Armani suit that had cost more than most people's car payments, and he walked with the specific kind of natural authority that has nothing to do with performance and everything to do with knowing in your bones and your history and the scar tissue of 2 decades of federal work exactly who you are. He adjusted his cuffs as he stepped out of his dark government-issue SUV, a habit something his hands did automatically while his eyes were already scanning the street. Not because he was looking for trouble, but because scanning was simply the way his mind moved through a space. The trained reflex of a man who had spent his career in rooms where danger disguised itself as ordinary. Darius Cole was the assistant special agent in charge of the FBI's Civil Rights Division. He had grown up in the rougher parts of South Side. Chicago had clawed his way through law school on determination and loans, and the particular fury of a man who understood exactly what doors were not being opened for him, and had spent the last 20 years doing work that mattered in ways that rarely made the news, dismantling human trafficking rings in Washington, rooting out corruption so deep in New Orleans that the indictments had taken 3 years to unseal building cases against people who believed their power made them untouchable. Today, however, he was not hunting criminals. He was hunting caffeine. He was early for a joint task force meeting with District Attorney Noel Ferris, who had suggested Grind and Grace on Millbrook Avenue, a place where the menu used the word artisanal 4 times, and the baristas wore aprons that matched the exposed brick. And so he pushed open the glass door, heard the small bell chime above him, and stepped inside. The interior was warm, amber-lit, full of the low hum of indie folk music, and the comfortable self-satisfaction of people who believed their zip code was a form of achievement. The conversation didn't stop when Darius entered, but it stuttered a half-beat pause, the kind that most people would miss, but that Darius had learned to read like weather, and then resumed a little more carefully, a little more aware of itself. He moved to the counter. The barista, a college student named Jessica, looked up and blinked, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before she reassembled it. He ordered black coffee, dark roast a blueberry scone for here paid, and moved to the pickup counter with his phone already out reading a message from his deputy director. The indictment is sealed. We move on the cartel at noon. He allowed himself a small, private satisfaction that had nothing to do with the room around him. He found a table near the window. He sat. He crossed his legs and took the first sip of his coffee, watching the street for Noel's silver Mercedes. 2 tables away, a 9-year-old girl named Lily looked up from the paper napkin she was drawing on. She had been making something that might have been a house or might have been a flower. It was difficult to tell, and watched him with the open, uncomplicated curiosity of a child who had not yet been taught to pretend she didn't notice things. Her red backpack was hooked on the back of her chair. Her mother was reading something on her phone. Lily watched Darius for a long moment, then went back to her drawing, adding a new figure in the corner of the napkin. a tall stick man in what appeared to be a very detailed rectangle that was probably supposed to be a suit. Officer Grant Loomis had been on patrol since 6:30 that morning and had found absolutely nothing worth doing, which was the kind of problem that ate at him more than he could have articulated if someone had asked. He was 38 years old, a 10-year veteran of the Oak Haven Police Department with a platinum blonde buzzcut going silver at the temples, in a way that made him look colder than he intended, a neck that strained against his collar, and a personnel file that had grown thick over the years with excessive force complaints. 16 of them stretching back to his 3rd year on the force, each one reviewed, each one closed, each one signed off on by an internal affairs process that happened to be run by his brother-in-law. He had peaked in high school in the way that certain men peak in high school, and he had spent the decade since working in a town that confirmed over and over that the instincts he trusted were the right ones, because nothing had ever happened to suggest otherwise. He drummed 2 fingers against the steering wheel in a slow, uneven rhythm, his eyes dragging across the storefronts of Millbrook Avenue with the restless, hollow hunger of a man who had not been genuinely needed in a very long time. Oak Haven was quiet. It was always quiet. The quiet that morning felt personal. His patrol car rolled past Grind and Grace at 8:14 a.m., and his eyes moved to the window, the way they always moved to windows scanning cataloging, and he saw the patrons, the women with the small dogs, the men in the fleece vests, the barista behind the counter, all of it familiar and unremarkable, and then he saw Darius Cole, a tall black man in an expensive suit sitting alone at a window table watching the street. Loomis's mind, shaped by a decade of prejudiced instinct and an internal affairs department that had never once pushed back, assembled a narrative in less than 3 seconds that had nothing to do with evidence and everything to do with the story he already needed to be true. He's casing the place, Loomis thought, or waiting for something. Doesn't belong here. He did not call it in. He did not run the plates of the dark SUV parked outside. He did not look for a report or a complaint or a single piece of information that might complicate the story already forming in his chest. He simply pulled the cruiser to the curb, put it in park, adjusted his belt, and stepped out with the slow, certain authority of a man who had never once been made to question his own judgment. Inside Grind and Grace, 2 tables from the window. Lily's crayon slowed without stopping as the patrol car parked outside. She filed the officer away the way children file away things that feel wrong before they have words for why. The heavy door opened and the familiar jingle of belt equipment filled the café, and the low hum of conversation did not stop, but it thinned the way sound thins in a room when everyone is suddenly paying attention to one thing while pretending to pay attention to something else. Loomis crossed the floor with manufactured purpose, each step calibrated to project authority. His eyes fixed on the window table, and Darius registered him before he was halfway across the room. The footsteps, the jingle, the shift in the room's atmosphere, and set his phone face down on the table and looked up and arranged his expression into the bureau face, neutral, unreadable, giving absolutely nothing away. Loomis stopped at the table and let the silence sit, his shadow falling across the phone screen, a power move that no academy had taught him, but that he had been practicing for years without realizing it. "You live around here?" Loomis asked, his thumbs hooked into his vest. Darius picked up his coffee cup. "Is there a problem?" "I asked you a question. Do you live in this neighborhood?" "I don't see how that's relevant," Darius said, his voice a deep, unhurried baritone. "I'm a paying customer having a coffee." Loomis shifted his weight. "We've had some complaints, reports of suspicious activity, men matching your description, loitering in businesses, making people uncomfortable." A woman at a nearby table pressed her lips together. Someone's coffee cup clinked against a saucer, and then there was no other sound. Darius looked at Loomis with eyes that had sat across from cartel bosses and serial killers, and watched them try to negotiate their way out of the inevitable, and said with a patience that was itself a form of pressure, "Matching my description. A man in a 3-piece suit eating a scone. Loomis's face reddened. His jaw tightened. This was the moment, the clear, undeniable fork in the road, where a smarter officer, a more self-aware officer, would have recognized that the man sitting in front of him spoke with the specific kind of calm legal precision that usually meant he had the power to back it up, and would have walked away, manufactured a reason, anything but. Loomis was not that officer, had never been that officer, and had never once, in 10 years, been forced to become him. 2 tables away, Lily had stopped drawing entirely. Her crayon rested on the edge of the napkin. She watched Loomis with the direct, unfiltered attention of a child who has not yet learned that looking away is sometimes expected of you. "Stand up," Loomis said. "I want to see some ID now." Darius leaned back in his chair, interlaced his fingers, and looked at the officer with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite patience, but something in between the look of a man watching someone make a decision they cannot unmake. "Officer," he said quietly, "I have not committed any crime. I have not broken any law. I have not been asked to leave by the establishment. Unless you can articulate a specific, reasonable suspicion that I am involved in criminal activity, I am going to finish my coffee." This was the kind of response that Loomis had been trained to recognize as legal and had been trained to resent anyway, and so he reached for Darius's arm and grabbed it, his hand closing over the expensive fabric of the suit jacket. And the moment that contact was made, something in the room cracked open, and everyone felt it. "Get your hands off me," Darius said. Not shouted, stated the way you state a fact about the weather. "You're resisting," Loomis shouted back. His voice climbing, playing to an imaginary camera he hoped would validate him later, and he yanked Darius upward. Darius stood 2 inches taller than Loomis, perfectly still, the solidity of a man who has decided that composure is the most devastating thing he can offer, and turned his face deliberately toward the security camera mounted in the corner of the ceiling. "I am not resisting," he said clearly for the record. "I am complying with physical force. I do not consent to this search or seizure. I have done nothing wrong." Loomis shoved him against the window. Darius's coffee cup tipped, and the dark roast spread slowly across the table, bleeding toward the edge, dripping off in quiet, steady drops. A small destruction that felt enormous in the silence of the room, like something being spilled that could not be gathered back up. The first cuff clicked onto Darius's left wrist with a sound that rang through the café like a struck note. The cold steel bit into his skin, and Darius closed his eyes for exactly 1 second, not in fear, not in defeat, but in the specific ancient exhaustion of a man who has been here before in 100 different forms, and has learned that the only way through is through. Then he told Loomis about the badge wallet in his inside pocket. Loomis pulled it out, flipped it open, and the gold FBI badge caught the light of the Edison bulbs overhead. Heavy detailed the eagle at the top, the bold blue letters. Federal Bureau of Investigation. Special Agent Darius Cole. Loomis stared at it. His brain tried to process the information and failed. Fake something told him. It has to be fake. He tossed the badge onto the coffee-soaked table with a sneer, declared it evidence of impersonation, and clicked the second cuff onto Darius's wrist. The room gasped. A man in a gray wool coat rose halfway from his chair and said, the badge looked real, and Loomis shouted him back down, and Lily's mother pulled Lily close, one arm wrapping around her daughter's shoulders, and Lily did not look away from Darius's face, watching him the way you watch someone in water who has decided very deliberately not to drown. They marched out through the front door of Grind and Grace with Loomis's hand on Darius's arm, and the patrons who had been frozen in their seats for the last 10 minutes were already moving. Not toward the door, not toward intervention, but toward their phones, held low and angled carefully, the small red recording lights blinking in the amber warmth of the café like tiny patient witnesses. Outside on Millbrook Avenue, the morning air was crisp and sharp, carrying the smell of fallen leaves in someone's distant fireplace. and Loomis pressed Darius against the hood of the patrol cruiser with a force that had nothing to do with necessity and everything to do with the particular violence of a man who feels his authority slipping and tries to recover it through weight, and the metal of the hood was cold through the fabric of the suit, and Darius pressed his cheek against it and said nothing. Loomis found the service weapon in its holster, a Glock registered to the United States government, and jumped back as though it had bitten him, drawing his own weapon, shouting "gun" at a volume designed to justify what was coming rather than describe what was actually happening. "I am a federal agent." Darius set his face against the hood, his voice carrying cleanly to the 3 phone cameras recording from across the street. "That is my service weapon. It is registered to the United States government. Please note that I am not resisting." It was at this moment that a silver Mercedes turned the corner onto Millbrook Avenue, moving with a kind of purpose that suggested the driver had just received a phone call that had changed her morning completely. District Attorney Noelle Ferris, sharp navy blazer, dark auburn hair, pulled back the kind of composure that comes from 15 years of walking into rooms where no one wanted her there, stepped out of the car and turned and saw the police cruiser, saw the coffee shop, patrons watching from the window, and then saw the man in the charcoal Armani suit pressed against the hood in handcuffs, and her face moved through disbelief recognition and a fury so clean and precise it looked almost like calm. She walked toward Loomis with the force of someone who has never needed volume to make a point. She told him in language that could not be misunderstood exactly who she was, and exactly who was handcuffed to the hood of his car, and Loomis stammered through his excuses, loitering the gun, the fake badge, each one smaller and less convincing than the last, each one an anchor he was drowning under. "Don't unlock them," Darius said. Noelle turned to look at him. "Don't unlock them," he repeated, and there was something in his voice, not anger, not even certainty exactly, but something deeper than both the tone of a man executing a plan that was already several steps ahead of everyone in the street. "He arrested me. He brought me here. We are going to the station, and we are going to do this on official record." 3 black Chevy Tahoes appeared at the far end of Millbrook Avenue, moving in formation, their grille lights flashing silently, not aggressive, not theatrical, simply inevitable, and they pulled up around the patrol car with the quiet precision of people who had done this before and knew exactly what they were doing. 6 FBI agents in tactical jackets spilled out. They did not draw their weapons. They did not need to. Senior Agent Miriam Torres walked to Loomis with the measured, almost gentle voice of someone offering a kindness that will not be offered twice. She believed he had her supervisor in handcuffs, and she needed him to step away slowly. Right now, if you're wondering why a man who could end this with one phone call chose instead to get in that car and ride to the station in handcuffs, stay with us, because what Darius Cole does next is the part that no one in Oak Haven will ever forget. If stories like this one matter to you, hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. It's the best way to make sure you don't miss what's coming. The ride to the Oak Haven Police Department was less a transport and more a funeral procession, and Loomis seemed to understand this in some wordless biological way, his knuckles bone white on the steering wheel, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, not to check on his prisoner, but to look at the convoy behind him, the 3 black Tahoes following with the patient, unhurried certainty of something that had already decided how this ended. Every turn he made they made. Every time he braked, they braked. There was no aggression in it, no theatrics, only the relentless, implacable presence of something you cannot outrun, because it is not chasing you. It is simply accompanying you toward the place you were always going to arrive. In the back seat, Darius sat with his hands behind him and watched the manicured lawns of Oak Haven roll past the window, the immaculate hedges, the children's bicycles locked to front porch railings, the sprinkler systems ticking through their morning routines, as though the world were completely ordinary, and he thought with the methodical calm of a man who does his best thinking in the eye of a storm about Title 18, Section 242 of the United States Code. deprivation of rights under color of law. He had written briefs about it. He had argued it in federal court. He had explained it to juries in language simple enough for anyone to understand. And now he was living it. And the living of it was both infuriating and, in some cold professional corner of his mind, almost clarifying. "You're quiet back there," Loomis said, his voice cracking slightly at the edges, revealing the hollow center beneath the bravado. Darius said nothing. "I said you're quiet." Loomis's hands tightened. "Look, if you just apologize for resisting, maybe I can talk to the chief. We get this down to a citation, you walk away clean. Nobody has to make a federal case out of it." He paused, apparently unaware of the specific irony of that phrase. Darius turned his head and looked through the plexiglass divider, finding Loomis's eyes in the rearview mirror, and held them. "Officer Loomis," he said, his voice so devoid of emotion it was almost peaceful, "you are operating under the impression that this is a negotiation. It is not. The act has been committed. The timeline is set. Everything you say to me between now and the station is evidence I will present at your sentencing hearing. So," he paused, "drive the car." Loomis slammed one hand against the steering wheel, a small, frustrated violence, and said nothing more. The station appeared at the end of the block, the familiar blue and white sign, the flag out front, the building that had always been a safe harbor for Loomis in the way that institutions become safe harbors for the people they protect without question. But as they pulled into the parking lot and the 3 Tahoes swung in behind them, blocking the exit in a smooth, practiced maneuver, the building did not look like a harbor anymore. It looked like a closing jaw, and Loomis was already inside it and had been without knowing it since the moment he tossed that badge onto a coffee-soaked table. Desk Sergeant Raymond Kowalski was 56 years old and had been working the booking desk at Oak Haven PD for 11 of them, and in that time he had developed the specific expertise of a man who can read the room before anyone has spoken, the way a musician hears a chord going wrong before it fully resolves. And so when the door from the Sallyport opened, and Loomis walked in with a prisoner in an Armani suit and an expression like a man walking toward a cliff he has already gone over, Raymond looked up from his sandwich and understood in a single sweeping glance that something was deeply wrong. "Hey, Bryce, what have you got?" he asked anyway, because that was the job, and because a half-second of normalcy sometimes told you what you needed to know about a situation. "Process him," Loomis said, pushing Darius toward the counter with a grip that was already loosening, already uncertain. "Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, impersonating a federal officer." Raymond looked at the prisoner. He looked at the expensive suit. He looked at the posture, the particular stillness of a man who was not defeated, was not afraid, was simply waiting with the patience of someone who already knew how the next hour was going to unfold. And then he looked out through the glass of the booking room door at the lobby where 6 FBI agents in tactical jackets were quietly and professionally making themselves impossible to ignore. He set his sandwich down. Loomis was sweating through his uniform, now small, dark patches spreading at the collar, and he kept his eyes fixed on the counter as though looking at the lobby might confirm something he was not ready to have confirmed. "Raymond?" Loomis said, his voice dropping. "Just book him." Raymond said slowly without moving. "Bryce, look at the monitors." The wall of security screens above the booking counter showed the lobby in real time. District Attorney Noelle Ferris at the front desk, leaning forward with an intensity that was clipping the audio on the camera microphone, her voice loud enough to carry through the glass. And behind her, visible through the front doors, a news van was already angling into the parking lot with the unhurried efficiency of a vehicle that knew it was going to be there for a while. Loomis looked at the monitors and said nothing. Darius leaned forward against the counter, the handcuffs clinking against the laminate, and said, "My name is Special Agent Darius Cole. I would like to speak to your chief." The door behind Raymond flew open. Chief Douglas Merritt came through it with his phone pressed to his ear, and his face the color of a man who has just been told something that has changed the nature of his afternoon completely. He was silver-haired, broadly built, with the specific kind of golf course tan that accumulates over years of long lunches and short afternoons, and his temper was legendary in the department for its volatility and its speed. But what crossed his face when he looked at Darius Cole was not anger. It was the pale, particular expression of a man counting the cost of something that has already happened and cannot be undone. He hung up the phone. He looked at Loomis. He said very quietly, "Take those cuffs off him." "Chief," he resisted. He had a fake, "Take them off." The sound of it bounced off the concrete walls. Loomis fumbled for his keys. His hands were shaking badly enough that the keys slipped from his fingers and clattered to the floor, sliding toward Darius's feet, and the sound of them landing in the silence of the booking room was somehow worse than everything that had come before it. Darius looked down at the keys. Then he looked up at Loomis. "Pick them up," he said. Loomis bent down slowly in his uniform in front of his chief and his desk sergeant and the security camera and the FBI agents visible through the glass, and picked up the keys and unlocked the handcuffs, and the entire room seemed to exhale and then hold its breath again. Darius rubbed his wrists. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at Merritt. "I'm keeping the cuffs," he said. "Evidence. Bag them." Then he said that he wanted to file a formal complaint, and that he wanted to use the interrogation room, and that he wanted Loomis in the squad room immediately writing his arrest report alone without a union representative, without time to coordinate a story. Raymond Kowalski, still standing behind the counter, watched all of this with the expression of a man doing quiet arithmetic. He had a nephew, 17 years old, who drove a used Honda Accord through suburbs exactly like Oakhaven 4 days a week on his way to track practice. The nephew's name was Marcus Jr., named after his father, and he was a good kid. A careful driver, someone who always called when he arrived somewhere. Raymond thought about the nephew standing in the booking room instead of Darius Cole in different clothes, without the badge, without the 20 years, and the arithmetic came out the same way it always did when he did it, and he did not like the answer. Something in Raymond Kowalski shifted quietly without announcement, in the way that things shift in people when the thing they have been not quite seeing finally comes fully into focus. The interrogation room at Oakhaven PD was exactly what interrogation rooms are always exactly: cinder block walls painted the specific shade of beige that suggests both institutional budget and institutional indifference. A metal table bolted to the floor, a two-way mirror that no one pretended wasn't there. Fluorescent lights with the faint irregular flicker of fixtures that should have been replaced 2 years ago. Darius sat in the suspect's chair with the ease of a man who has sat in a great many rooms designed to make people uncomfortable and has never once found the discomfort useful. Chief Merritt sat across from him, his hands folded on the table, his political smile deployed with the reflexive precision of a man who has been relying on it for 30 years. Noelle Ferris stood in the corner with her arms crossed, watching. "Agent Cole." Merritt began smoothing his tie. "I want you to know that Oakhaven PD takes incidents like this extremely seriously. Officer Loomis is old school. He's a family man. He makes mistakes, but we can address this internally, and I can personally guarantee—" "I have 3 children," Darius said. Merritt stopped. "My eldest is 18. He drives a Honda Civic. He drives through towns like this one on his way to college visits." Darius looked at the chief with eyes that were not angry and not performative and not anything except truthful. "If Officer Loomis had pulled him over instead of me, would my son be sitting in this chair, or would I be identifying him somewhere else?" He let the question sit in the room for a moment, long enough for it to become the furniture. "I'm not asking you to answer that. I'm telling you what this is actually about." Merritt tugged at his collar. "That's speculative. We're here to discuss the incident." "We're here to discuss a pattern," Darius said. and he reached into his inside pocket and produced a folded sheet of paper notes he had made on the back of a briefing document during the ride to the station, written in the precise, unhurried handwriting of a man who knows exactly what he is building. Officer Loomis has 16 excessive force complaints filed against him over 6 years. 13 of those complaints involved minority civilians. Every single one was reviewed and closed by your Internal Affairs Division. Every single one was signed off on by Sergeant Dale Briggs. He paused. Who is, I believe, Officer Loomis's brother-in-law? Merritt's face did something complicated. Internal Affairs operates independently. Sergeant Briggs and Officer Loomis attended the same high school, Darius said. They were in the same graduating class. Their wives are sisters. I made 2 phone calls from the back of the cruiser. He folded the paper. I'm the FBI chief. We know how to find things. Noelle Ferris stepped forward from the corner. She spoke in the measured, irrevocable tone of someone closing a door. Chief, I am opening a formal investigation into this department's use of force practices effective immediately. I will not be standing beside you when the federal oversight begins, and I would strongly recommend you consult your own attorney before this afternoon. Merritt turned to her. Noelle, we're on the same team. We were, she said without particular cruelty. In the booking area, Raymond Kowalski pulled his personal cell phone from his pocket and opened his contacts. He found the number for Derek Vaughn's law office, a number he had never called before, had written down once 3 years ago after reading a civil rights case in the newspaper and thinking in some inarticulate way just in case, and he typed a single message from an unregistered account, the station's address, and the words, "Preserve everything." Then he put his phone away, picked up his sandwich, and went back to looking like a man who hadn't just changed the shape of what was coming. After Darius left the building with Noelle Ferris and the FBI convoy pulled away from the parking lot in the same silent, inevitable formation in which it had arrived, Chief Douglas Merritt did something that would have seemed to anyone watching like a perfectly ordinary administrative task. He walked to the squad room, pulled the door closed behind him, turned the lock, and lowered the blinds. Then he switched off his body camera. Officer Loomis was sitting at a desk in front of a blank word processing document, the cursor blinking with the patient indifference of a machine waiting for a human to make a decision. He looked up when the chief entered, and what was in his face was no longer arrogance. The arrogance had been used up, burned through, and what was underneath it was something rawer and more frightened, the expression of a man who has done the math and does not like the sum. I've been thinking, Loomis said, the words coming out fast, unorganized, tumbling over each other in the way that words do when a mind is running ahead of its own composure. There's a way out of this. If I had a 911 call, an anonymous tip, someone reporting a man with a gun matching his description, then I had probable cause. If I had probable cause, the stop was legal. If the stop was legal, the lawsuit collapses. Merritt stood in the center of the room and looked at him for a long moment. There was no 911 call, Merritt said. We could make one, Loomis said, retroactively. The timestamp on the CAD entry, we say there was a server lag. I have a secondary phone unregistered. We create the call. Now we enter it into the system with an 809 timestamp. It looks like it's always been there. Vaughn subpoenas the dispatch logs. He sees a call. He can't build a civil rights case if I had a legitimate reason for the stop. The room was very quiet. Merritt thought about his pension. He thought about the election year and the editorial board at the local paper and the $5.6 million that a civil rights attorney like Derek Vaughn could extract from a city with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it many times before. He thought about all the small, ordinary corruptions he had approved over the years, the signed-off complaints, the closed investigations, the brother-in-law in Internal Affairs who understood what was expected of him, and he recognized that this was simply one more, only louder, only more visible, only with a federal agent on the other end of it, instead of a civilian who wouldn't know where to take it. He walked to the desk. He sat down. He navigated to the computer-aided dispatch system with the administrative privileges that gave him access to every log, every record, every entry in the department's history, and he opened a new field and he typed, "Call type suspicious person man with a gun." Location, grind, and grace. 88 Millbrook Avenue. Caller anonymous. Time 8:09 a.m. Notes: male black suit gun visible at waistband caller fearful for safety. He hit enter. The fabricated record slotted itself into the timeline with the seamless indistinguishability of a lie told in a language that only shows the surface. What neither man knew was that Darius Cole's watch, a vintage-style Omega, a gift from his wife on the day of his last promotion, which she had handed him in a box with a card that said, "For the moments when they try to take." Everything was not simply a watch. It was a bureau-issue surveillance device modified and disguised for use by senior agents in field operations, with a 48-hour battery and a microphone sensitive enough to distinguish a whisper from ambient office noise at a distance of 15 feet. It had been in the evidence bag on Raymond Kowalski's desk, 3 feet from the unlocked squad room door the entire time, and it had been recording since the moment Loomis put it in the bag, and it recorded everything. Now, Merritt's voice. Loomis's voice. The specific language of the fabrication. The soft, satisfied exhale Merritt made when he pressed enter with the patient, indifferent clarity of a machine that does not judge and does not forget. Chief Merritt retrieved the clear plastic evidence bag from the desk sergeant's counter with the practiced surface-level cheerfulness of a man who has decided the crisis is manageable and is already working on the version of events he will present to the city council. Inside the bag, a badge wallet, a cell phone, and a vintage Omega watch with a face so analog, so deliberately understated that it looked like exactly what it was pretending to be, a sentimental piece of jewelry given by a wife to a husband who worked too hard and deserved something beautiful for it. Merritt did not notice the tiny pulse of a red pixel on the watch face. He was not looking for it, and even if he had been, he would not have known what it meant. He walked into the lobby with his political smile fully operational and found Darius Cole standing near the front desk with a tall man in an immaculate pinstriped suit beside him. Derek Vaughn, civil rights attorney. The most feared name in his field in the Midwest, a man who sued cities for their institutional failures the way a surgeon removes tumors methodically, completely, and without sentiment. Merritt held out the evidence bag. "Agent Cole, your personal effects. And again, on behalf of this department, I want to extend our most sincere apologies for what was clearly a significant communication breakdown. Officer Loomis acted on incomplete information, and I can assure you that—" Darius took the bag. He opened it, slowly removed the watch, and strapped it to his wrist with the unhurried attention of a man who has no reason to rush anything anymore. He pressed his thumb lightly against the face of the watch, just once, the way you might check that a door is closed. A tiny icon appeared on the display. Recording saved. He looked at Merritt. He looked at the squad room door still closed. He ran the geometry in his mind, where the bag had sat. How far from the door, how long the watch had been in the bag. What the microphone on a device rated for undercover field operations could hear through a hollow-core interior door at a range of 3 feet, and the calculation took approximately 2 seconds and arrived at a number that was everything. He said nothing. He let his face give Merritt exactly what Merritt needed to see nothing alarming, nothing that would cause the chief to revisit the locked room, and the unlocked door, and the evidence bag sitting just outside, and Merritt reading the absence of a reaction. As confirmation that he had gotten away with it, exhaled very slightly and widened his smile. Outside in Vaughn's black sedan, Darius plugged the watch into a small field reader and played the audio back through a single earpiece, and then he handed the earpiece to Vaughn and watched the attorney's face as Merritt's voice came through, and then Loomis's voice, and then the soft percussion of the enter key being pressed, and a career ending. Vaughn removed the earpiece. He looked at Darius with the focused, almost predatory calm of a man recalculating the entire shape of a case in real time. "Do not release this yet," Vaughn said. "Not to the press, not to anyone." "Why not?" "Because if we release it now, they resign. They apologize. They get probation and a sad press conference, and Oak Haven moves on in 6 months." Vaughn started the engine, glancing back at the station through the rear window. "We wait for the deposition. We put them under oath. We let them construct the lie officially on the record with a court reporter and a camera. We let them commit perjury. And then," he said, pulling into traffic, "we drop the hammer. That is how we make sure they never hold authority again." The conference room at Vaughn and Associates occupied the 32nd floor of a Chicago high-rise, all glass and dark mahogany, and the kind of view of the city skyline that was designed specifically to remind people how small their problems were about to become. It was a room where settlements happened, where careers ended on the record, where the truth had a way of becoming very expensive very quickly. On one side of the long table sat Officer Grant Loomis and Chief Douglas Merritt, flanked by the city attorney Peter Hollins, a compact, careful man in a gray suit who smelled faintly of antacids and whose eyes had the slightly overworked quality of someone who had been doing damage control for 3 weeks straight and had not yet been told how much worse it was about to get. They had submitted the fabricated CAD log into Discovery 2 days earlier, and they had reviewed it together, and they had agreed that it was indistinguishable from the real record surrounding it, and that agreement had given them something that felt like confidence, which is a very specific and very dangerous thing to feel when you are walking into a room where you are about to be asked to repeat a lie under oath. On the other side sat Darius Cole and Derek Vaughn. A court reporter was positioned at the head of the table, her fingers ready. A video camera on a tripod had its red light blinking. Vaughn began slowly, deliberately, with the unhurried ease of a man who knows exactly how much time he has and has decided to use all of it. Background questions. First, training years of service departmental policies. The structure of the internal review process. Loomis answered with the rehearsed fluency of a man who had spent 3 weeks preparing for this, each response landing with the slightly too smooth quality of something that has been practiced rather than remembered. Then, "Officer Loomis, walk me through your reason for entering Grind and Grace on the morning of October 14th. Loomis straightened in his chair. "I was responding to a dispatch call. Report of a man matching the suspect's description, black male suit gun visible at the waistband, came through on my terminal at 8:09 a.m. You received this call before entering the establishment." "Correct. And you are testifying under oath that this dispatch record existed before you made contact with Mr. Cole?" "Absolutely." Loomis's voice did not waver. Only the microscopic twitch in the corner of his left eye, the tell that Darius had been watching for since the deposition began, moved. "I followed protocol. I responded to a citizen report. The stop was fully justified." Vaughn turned to Merritt. "Chief, you personally retrieved and reviewed the dispatch logs. Can you verify their authenticity for the record?" Merritt adjusted his tie, a small, unconscious gesture. "Yes. I pulled the logs myself within 2 hours of the incident. The call came in at 8:09 a.m., consistent with Officer Loomis's account. The record is genuine." Darius sat perfectly still through all of it, watching, not reacting, his hands flat on the table in front of him, his face giving back exactly nothing. He had waited 3 weeks for this moment. He had constructed it with Vaughn with the specific patience of men who understand that the truth is not always the first thing that arrives in a room, but it is always the last thing standing. Peter Hollins. The city attorney had been clicking his pen throughout the deposition in the unconscious rhythm of a man managing low-grade anxiety. And now, as Vaughn reached into his briefcase, the clicking stopped. The room noticed. Derek Vaughn placed a USB drive on the table between the two sides, with the quiet certainty of a man setting down a key. "I'd like to introduce into evidence," he said, his voice dropping to something almost conversational, "a forensic digital analysis of the Oak Haven Police Department's server, specifically the CAD system log files, and their metadata, including the timestamp of when each entry was created, and whether that timestamp matches the system's own access logs." Peter Hollins stopped breathing for a moment. "The metadata on the dispatch entry you have both testified to," Vaughn continued, without hurry, "shows that it was created at 4:47 p.m. on the day of the incident, not 8:09 a.m., not before Officer Loomis entered Grind and Grace, at 4:47 p.m., more than 8 hours after the arrest." He let that sit. "The entry was backdated. The CAD system does not allow standard users to backdate entries, which means whoever created this record had administrative privileges. Chief Merritt, you testified you have administrative access to the CAD system. Is that correct?" Merritt's mouth opened and nothing came out. "In addition," Vaughn said, reaching forward and plugging the USB into his laptop, "I have an audio recording." "Objection," Hollins said, but his voice had lost its architecture. "On what basis?" "My client is a senior federal agent who carries a bureau-issue surveillance device as part of his standard field equipment," Vaughn said. "When his personal effects were seized and placed in an evidence bag, the device continued to operate. It was sitting approximately 3 feet from the squad room door for 47 minutes. He looked at Merritt. "The door that you locked, Chief, the door next to which you switched off your body camera." He turned up the volume. The voice of Chief Douglas Merritt filled the conference room, clear and unmistakable, and completely irreversibly real. "We just need probable cause. The time of the incident was around 8:20, so we need a call at 8:09. Then Loomis, "It looks real." Then Merritt, "It is real now. When that lawyer subpoenas the logs, this is what he gets." The silence that followed was the particular kind of silence that has weight and texture. The silence of 2 careers ending simultaneously in a mahogany room on the 32nd floor, while a court reporter typed every second of it into the permanent record. Loomis looked like he had stepped off a ledge and was still processing the fall. Merritt stared at the table, his mouth slightly open. The golf course tan faded to something gray and deflated, his hands very still in a way that hands go still when a body has stopped receiving useful instructions. Peter Hollins closed his folder. He pushed his chair back approximately 6 inches, the precise physical distance of a man separating himself from something he has just understood he cannot survive proximity to. "I need to call the mayor," Hollins said. "There will be no recess," Darius said. He stood up, and for the first time in the entire deposition he was simply himself, not performing patience, not managing a room, not making a strategic choice about what to reveal. He was the assistant special agent in charge of the FBI's Civil Rights Division, and he looked exactly like it. The conference room door opened. 4 FBI agents in suits entered, and the handcuffs on their belts were not decorative. Grant Loomis and Douglas Merritt were placed under arrest conspiracy to deprive civil rights obstruction of justice perjury in the same room where 20 minutes earlier they had believed they were winning. Vaughn turned to Peter Hollins, who had gone the color of office paper. "The settlement is $5.6 million and a federal consent decree over Oak Haven PD. Independent oversight, mandatory body cameras with tamper-proof storage, public quarterly reporting. If your answer is no, the audio goes to every major news network in 60 minutes. Hollins looked at the handcuffed chief. He looked at Darius Cole. He said very quietly that he would draft the check. The United States District Court for the Northern District of Illinois was the kind of room that had been designed over decades to make people feel the weight of what happened in it. High ceilings, dark wood, the particular acoustics of a space where silence between words carries as much meaning as the words themselves, and on the morning that Grant Loomis and Douglas Merritt were sentenced, every seat was full. Reporters occupied the press gallery in the organized, slightly restless way of people who already know the headline and are waiting for the quote that will carry it. Civil rights attorneys sat together near the back, and scattered throughout the rest of the gallery were the citizens of Oak Haven, the yoga pants, and the Patagonia vests, and the people who had driven German cars past those manicured lawns for years and had told themselves, without ever quite saying it aloud, that the police department was simply doing what needed to be done to keep things orderly. Loomis and Merritt stood before Judge Patricia Wentworth in orange jumpsuits, and the transformation was startling in the specific way that power always looks startling when it is removed. Loomis, smaller than he had seemed, his platinum buzzcut grown out to something dull and undifferentiated. The thick-necked authority replaced by a hollow around the eyes that had not been there before. Merritt's hands trembling slightly at the defense table. The golf course tan faded entirely, now his silver hair somehow less impressive in the fluorescent light of a courtroom than it had been under the warm amber of his own office. Judge Wentworth adjusted her glasses. She spoke without raising her voice, which made the room very quiet to hear her. "I have seen in my years on this bench a great many kinds of wrong," she said. "Men who stole because they were hungry. Men who hurt people because they were afraid. Men who made terrible decisions in terrible moments and carried those decisions for the rest of their lives." She paused. "What I see today is something different. What I see today are two men who held positions of public trust positions that existed specifically to protect people, and who used those positions deliberately and repeatedly to harm the people they were supposed to protect, and then conspired to falsify public records to avoid accountability for that harm." She looked at them. "You did not make a mistake. You made a choice. And then you made another choice and another. And each one was a deliberate decision to place your comfort above someone else's rights." Loomis received his sentence first. Federal prison, no possibility of parole. His wife, seated in the third row, made a sound that she immediately tried to contain and could not entirely, and the effort of containing it was somehow worse than the sound itself. Loomis closed his eyes. He would not be there when his daughter walked across a graduation stage. He would not be there for his son's first car, his son's first apartment, the ordinary accumulation of a life moving forward. He had traded all of that for the particular pleasure of never once being wrong about anything, and the trade had been final. Merritt received his sentence next. When the marshal moved toward him, he looked once at Darius Cole, who was seated in the front row, and something crossed his face that was not quite an apology and not quite understanding, but was perhaps the earliest, rawest edge of both the moment just before a man is able to name what he did and why it mattered and who it cost. The word inmate, spoken by the marshal as he moved Loomis toward the door, landed in the room like something physical. The following week, the Oak Haven City Council held an emergency session in a town hall that could not hold everyone who wanted to attend. The mayor stood at the podium and announced what the $5.6 million settlement meant in practical terms because the department's insurance policy had an exclusion for willful misconduct. The fabricated logs had made it impossible to argue the arrest was an error, and so the money had to come from the general fund directly, immediately, and the consequences were specific. A high school renovation, canceled library hours cut by half property taxes, raised for 3 years. The room did not take it quietly, and in the third row of the town hall, Lily sat beside her mother with her red backpack on her lap, watching the mayor speak. Not entirely understanding the words, but understanding the feeling in the room. The specific overdue feeling of people who had been comfortable for a long time, finally being asked to feel something they had been successfully avoiding, and finding that it cost more than they had expected, and that this was, in some way, entirely the point. She would think about that feeling for a long time afterward. She would think about the man from the café and his coffee cup tipping over and the sound the handcuffs made and the way he had looked at the security camera and said, "I am not resisting. not for the people in the room, but for whoever would be watching later, whoever needed to know what had really happened, and she would understand in the way that children sometimes understand things more completely than the adults around them, that being right was not the same as being safe, and that the difference between those two things was exactly what the building on Millbrook Avenue was going to be for. The settlement check sat on the corner of Darius Cole's desk in his Chicago office for 4 days before he did anything with it, and in those 4 days he did not think about what it could buy him: the house somewhere quieter, the early retirement, the particular luxury of never having to walk into another room and scan it before he sat down, because that was not what the money was for, and he had known what it was for since approximately the moment he had looked at Merritt's face in the lobby of the Oak Haven Police Department and understood that the watch had heard everything. He had already filed the paperwork. The entire $5. $6 million would establish a non-profit legal defense organization headquartered in Oak Haven, staffed by civil rights attorneys with the specific mandate to audit every arrest the department made, represent without charge every person who was wrongfully stopped, searched or detained, and file a formal complaint every single time the department stepped outside the boundaries of lawful conduct. It would be funded in perpetuity by the settlement. It would be reviewed annually by a federal oversight board. It would operate 2 blocks from Grind and Grace on the corner of Millbrook and 3rd, in a building that was being renovated right now and whose sign already in production would read the Loomis Merritt Center for Civil Rights. Noel Ferris, who had resigned as district attorney and was now in private practice, read the name on the brochure and laughed a genuine laugh, the kind that surprised her, and then looked at Darius with something that was not quite awe and not quite disbelief, but contained elements of both. "You named it after them," she said. "I want their names on that building," Darius said quietly, looking out the window at the Chicago skyline. "I want every officer in that station to drive past it every single morning and understand that abusing your power doesn't just cost you your career. It funds forever the protection of the people you tried to harm." On the first Tuesday of November, Darius Cole walked into Grind and Grace alone. No FBI convoy, no attorney in a pinstriped suit, no cameras, no reporters, no significance visible to anyone who happened to be looking. Just a man in a charcoal suit pushing open a glass door, hearing the small bell above it chime, stepping into the warm amber light and the low hum of indie folk music. Jessica was behind the counter. She had been there on the morning of October 14th, and she was here now, and when she looked up and saw him, her hands went still for a moment, not in fear, not in the faltering uncertainty of that first morning, but in something quieter and more considered, the recognition of a person who has thought about a moment many times and is now standing inside it. She met his eyes when she handed him the cup. She said simply, "It's good to see you back." He said thank you and meant it entirely. He found the same window table. He sat. He crossed his legs and took the first sip of the dark roast and watched Millbrook Avenue through the glass, the morning foot traffic, the German cars, the patrol car that rolled past slowly at 8:22 a.m. The officer inside it glancing at the café window and continuing without stopping. Everything ordinary. Everything unremarkable. The absence of an incident being its own kind of statement about what had changed. On the table beside his, someone had left a paper napkin. On it, in the uncertain, enthusiastic lines of a child's hand, was a drawing, a tall stick figure in a carefully detailed rectangle that was clearly supposed to be a suit, standing very straight, surrounded by smaller figures, all looking at him. In the corner of the napkin, in large looping letters that were just barely legible, "The man who didn't move." Darius looked at the drawing for a long time. Then he picked it up, folded it carefully, and put it in the inside pocket of his jacket, close to where the badge wallet always sat. Grant Loomis and Douglas Merritt began their federal sentences in separate facilities, and Oak Haven PD was placed under a consent decree that brought independent federal monitors into the department, mandatory body cameras with tamper-proof cloud storage, and a civilian review board with actual authority, not because anyone in the department had asked for accountability, but because the price of operating without it had finally been calculated in dollars, specific enough for a city council to vote on. The Loomis Merritt Center for Civil Rights opened its doors on a gray November morning without a ceremony, without a ribbon, without speeches, just a sign on a building and a phone number on a website, and 4 civil rights attorneys sitting at desks waiting for whoever needed them first. In its first 30 days, it took 11 cases. It won 4 of them. It filed formal complaints against the department twice. The officers who drove past it on their way to morning shifts did not discuss it openly, but they all knew it was there. And knowing changed something that could not be fully measured, but could absolutely be felt in the way people inside the building began to think about decisions before they made them. Darius Cole went back to the work that had always been his real work, the large organized darkness, the cases that took years, the kind of justice that does not arrive quickly or cleanly, but arrives nonetheless. He did not give interviews about Oak Haven. He did not need to. 2 blocks from the coffee shop where a man in a platinum buzzcut had once decided that a black man in an Armani suit had no business being comfortable. A building stood with 2 names on it in large permanent letters, and every morning the light fell across those letters, the same way it falls across everything in a town that thought it had nothing left to learn honestly and without mercy and without looking away.